I am Norah. I am 31. And the morning I legally adopted my son, I sat in a Missoula courthouse with 3 rows of empty mahogany benches behind me. My parents and my sister had organized a formal boycott of the hearing. My father, a man who treats our Montana family tree like a thoroughbred registry, had told me to my face that no stranger would ever inherit Dixon land. They wanted me to sit in that echoing room and feel the crushing weight of their absence. They wanted me to panic and hand the boy back to the state. But as the judge struck his gavel, sealing the adoption forever, I just smiled. Because here is what my family did not know. The sick little boy sitting on my hip was not a stranger at all. I had the medical records and a private DNA test locked in a safe at home. When my parents finally crashed my celebration lunch hours later to save their public image, they looked down into the baby's blue eyes and saw the one secret they had spent a fortune trying to bury. Welcome back to Aura Vengeance, where quiet endurance always outlasts loud entitlement. If you enjoy stories of earned justice, you are in the right place. Drop a comment telling me your age, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a story. The Missoula County Courthouse smelled like floor wax and radiator heat. It was a Tuesday morning. The oak bench beneath me felt cold through my skirt. I sat in the second row of courtroom 3B, balancing a 14-month-old boy on my hip. Leo gripped a stuffed corduroy bear by one ear, his thumb resting near his lower lip. Behind me stretched 3 rows of seating. Not a single winter coat draped over the railing, not a clearing of a throat. Just the hum of the air system pushing warmth through iron grates. My phone vibrated in the side pocket of my leather tote. I did not need to guess the sender. I shifted Leo to my other side, retrieved the device, and glanced at the lock screen. It was my older sister, Vanessa. The text read, "Hope you are happy playing Savior. Mom is in tears." I read the text twice. I did not type a reply. I did not sigh or shake my head. I simply pressed the side button, turning the screen black, and slipped the phone back into the bag. A year ago, a message like that would have sent a spike of adrenaline into my throat. I would have drafted a dozen apologies trying to bridge a gap they had intentionally widened. Today, my pulse remained steady. The silence in the courtroom felt less like an absence and more like a moat I had finally drawn up around myself. Norah Dixon Judge Miller called out. He was a stern man with silver hair and reading glasses perched near the tip of his nose. He flipped open a manila folder on his elevated desk. "We are here for the finalization of adoption for Leo." I stood up. My heels clicked against the linoleum. 2 of my co-workers from the pediatric clinic, Sarah and Mark, sat in the front row. They offered quiet, encouraging smiles. They were the entirety of my cheering section. Ms. Dixon, the judge, continued peering over the rim of his glasses toward the gallery behind me. He noted the vacant benches. A brief flicker of pity crossed his eyes. "It appears your support system is intimate today." "It is exactly who needs to be here, Your Honor," I replied. My voice held no tremor. Judge Miller nodded, adjusting his posture. He read through the standard declarations, the rights, the responsibilities, the permanent legal transfer of guardianship. Every word echoed off the high plaster ceiling. Then, by the authority vested in me by the state of Montana, he said, lifting the wooden gavel, "I declare this child legally yours." The sound of the wood striking the block was sharp and final. Leo flinched slightly at the noise, burying his face into my neck. I rubbed his back, smelling the faint trace of oatmeal and baby shampoo. My family had staged this boycott as a punishment. My brother Spencer was currently running for state senate on a family values platform, and my parents treated his campaign like a royal coronation. 6 months prior, sitting around our mahogany dining table, I had announced my intention to foster a sick child with the goal of adoption. My father had slammed his fist down, rattling the crystal wine glasses. "Choose the stray or choose the family," he had demanded. I chose the baby. They believed their absence today would cast a shadow over my life. They thought they held all the power. They had no idea that the ink drying on Judge Miller's decree did not just give me a son, it legally locked them out of the most devastating truth they had ever hidden. I pushed the heavy brass doors of the courthouse open and stepped into the crisp Montana morning. The frost in the air bit at my cheeks, offering a sharp reminder of the season. I tucked the thick wool blanket tighter around Leo, shielding his fragile chest from the wind as we walked toward the parking lot. The manila folder containing the signed judicial decree sat heavy in my leather tote bag. It consisted of just a few sheets of standard legal paper, yet it carried the dense, irreversible weight of a severed dynasty. To understand why those 3 rows of mahogany benches remained vacant during the most important moment of my life, you have to understand the specific gravity the Dixon name holds in this valley. We are not just comfortable. My father, Richard Dixon, owns half the commercial skyline. Driving through our town means passing endless rows of pristine subdivisions, luxury retail complexes, and sprawling office parks, all bearing our surname engraved on polished slate signs. My father operates under the steadfast delusion that he is modern royalty. He traces our lineage back to the early copper pioneers, treating our bloodline like a sacred, exclusive trust. You do not marry into our family without a rigorous background check. You certainly do not bring an orphaned ward of the state into the fold. My brother Spencer serves as the golden manifestation of this obsession. He is 34 years old, favors tailored suits paired with expensive leather boots that have never touched actual mud, and possesses a bright, rehearsed smile engineered for campaign flyers. He is currently running for the state Senate. His political platform rests heavily on traditional family values, preserving local heritage, and protecting the vulnerable youth of our state. The bitter irony of that last talking point is a pill I have been forced to swallow in silence for over a year. He is the heir apparent, groomed since childhood to inherit the empire. My older sister Vanessa plays the role of the devoted socialite, hosting charity luncheons and curating an impeccable social media feed to polish the family crest. Then there is me. I manage operations at a local pediatric clinic. I wear practical flat shoes, drive a sensible 9-year-old sedan, and flatly refuse to participate in the country club theater my mother choreographs. I was already the resident disappointment long before Leo entered the picture. Choosing to foster a sick child was merely the final strike that shattered their tolerance. 6 months ago, I attended the mandatory Sunday dinner at my parents' sprawling estate. The dining room is a cavernous, intimidating space dominated by a 12-foot mahogany table. Heavy silver cutlery clinked softly against fine porcelain china. The air smelled of roasted lamb, fresh rosemary, and the expensive beeswax candles my mother imports from a boutique in Seattle. The tension at these weekly gatherings is always thick, requiring a delicate, exhausting navigation of fragile egos. I waited until the plates were cleared and the serving staff poured the dark roast coffee. I set my silver spoon down on the saucer and announced my intention to foster a child with severe medical needs, noting my plan to adopt him when the state cleared the paperwork. I anticipated the immediate backlash, so I planted a deliberate piece of fiction to protect the process. I told my family the baby was an interstate transfer from the Nevada system. I framed it as a bureaucratic shuffle to alleviate overcrowding in their facilities. I sat back and watched the fabricated information settle over them. This specific lie was vital. By labeling the child an outsider from a distant state, I fed directly into their deep-seated prejudice against anyone not born to local elite circles. It ensured they would dismiss the boy entirely and never look close enough to ask questions about his actual origins. They dropped their guard, blinded by their own practiced snobbery. My mother Diane paused with her delicate coffee cup halfway to her painted lips. She looked at me as if I had suggested bringing a feral animal into her pristine parlor. She muttered a thinly veiled insult about poor genetics, inherited behavioral issues, and the sheer unpredictability of unknown parentage. She smoothed the cuffs of her silk blouse as she spoke, physically brushing away the concept of my son. Spencer shifted in his high-backed chair, his mind instantly calculating the public relations angle. He asked how it would look for his Senate campaign to have an unwed sister raising a state dependent. He worried aloud that my unconventional choice would dilute his carefully curated image of the traditional nuclear unit. His concern was entirely selfish, focused only on polling numbers and donor perceptions. My father did not offer subtle critiques. Richard Dixon does not negotiate, and he rarely lowers his voice. He raised his heavy fist and brought it down hard against the polished mahogany. The crystal water goblets shuddered. The sharp sound echoed off the high plaster ceilings, silencing the room. "No stranger inherits Dixon land," he stated. His tone was low, rough, and entirely uncompromising. He pointed a steady finger at me across the vast expanse of the dining table. He issued his final ultimatum right then. I could choose the Nevada stray, or I could choose my family, my robust trust fund, and my secure future within the empire. There would be no middle ground. I looked at the three of them. My father sat rigid, his face red, with unquestioned authority. My mother stared intently at her coffee saucer, refusing to meet my eyes. My brother typed rapidly on his phone, already dismissing the conversation as a solved problem. They expected me to fold. They had spent 3 decades training me to bend to the weight of the Dixon wallet. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply pushed my heavy wooden chair back, folded my white linen napkin, and placed it neatly next to my untouched dessert. I stood up, retrieved my wool coat from the hallway closet, and walked out the heavy front doors without uttering another word. Driving away from the wrought iron gates of the estate that night, my hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The immense gravity of my choice settled over me in the dark silence of the car. I had traded a $1 billion inheritance, a lifetime of guaranteed financial security, and the only family I had ever known. I traded all of it for a sick infant sleeping in a borrowed municipal crib. But as I pulled into the narrow driveway of my modest condo and checked the glowing screen of the baby monitor, I knew I would make the same trade 1,000 times over, without hesitation. Back in the present, I opened the rear door of my sedan and carefully buckled Leo into his car seat in the courthouse parking lot. He drifted to sleep before I even turned the key in the ignition. The silence of my family today was meant to serve as the ultimate punishment, a cold reminder of my isolation. But the truth is, the last 14 months had not been a quiet, peaceful standoff. My father did not just let me walk away to build my own life. When cutting me out of the will failed to make me surrender, the boy Richard Dixon decided to dismantle my reality piece by piece. The empty benches at the courthouse were just public optics. The real war had been a brutal, calculated siege on my livelihood, and I had spent the last year fighting to keep my head above water while a hidden ghost in Leo's medical file waited quietly in the dark. I pulled out of the courthouse parking lot and merged onto the highway, keeping the heater on low. The rhythm of the tires against the asphalt matched the steady rise and fall of Leo sleeping in the back seat. To look at him now, swaddled in soft wool and breathing deeply, you would never guess the terrifying fragility of his first year. The narrative my family spun to their country club friends painted me as a rebellious martyr playing house with a healthy, disposable prop. The reality of the last 14 months resembled a grueling, solitary marathon waged in the dark. Leo was not just a ward of the state. He was chronically ill. His lungs were a battlefield. During his first winter with me, a simple cold would cascade into severe respiratory distress within hours. My life shrank to the dimensions of his nursery and the sterile corridors of the local hospital. Sleep became a luxury I traded for vigilance. I learned to interpret the subtle shifts in his breathing, distinguishing a normal cough from the sharp, rattling wheeze that signaled an incoming attack. My bedside table resembled a pharmacy counter cluttered with plastic syringes, saline vials, and the heavy vibrating compressor of a nebulizer machine. There is a specific kind of isolation that settles into your bones at 3 a.m. inside an emergency room. I spent a dozen nights sitting under the harsh, buzzing, fluorescent lights of Missoula General. The chairs in the pediatric wing were covered in stiff, sanitized vinyl that offered no warmth. I would sit for hours, cradling Leo against my chest, holding a clear plastic oxygen mask over his nose and mouth. The machine hissed, pushing medication mist into his struggling lungs. The smell of the aerosol was sharp and metallic. On one particularly brutal night in February, the snow drifting heavily against the hospital windows, I watched Leo fight for every breath. His skin carried a pale, translucent quality under the clinical lighting. As the treatment finally began to open his airways, his eyelids fluttered open. He stared up at me. His eyes were striking. They possessed an icy, piercing shade of blue, distinct from the standard pale eyes of most infants. It was a genetic signature, sharp and unmistakable. As I watched his chest hitch and shudder, a strange dissonance tugged at the edge of my memory. The cadence of his wheezing, the specific way his ribs pulled inward beneath his collarbone, felt eerily familiar. My brother Spencer had suffered from identical, terrifying asthma attacks during our childhood. I remembered standing in the hallway of our sprawling estate at 10 years old, watching paramedics rush into my brother's bedroom. I remembered Spencer's face pale and drawn, his chest hitching in the exact same rhythmic struggle. And I remembered the color of my brother's eyes when he looked at me through the crack in the door. That same striking, icy blue. At the time sitting in the emergency room, I dismissed the parallel as a trick of my exhausted mind. I chalked it up to the coincidence of shared human ailments and local demographics. I was too tired to entertain the impossible. Survival required all my mental bandwidth, especially because the medical crises were not the only war I was fighting. My father is not a man who accepts defeat. When I walked away from the dining table and forfeited my inheritance, Richard Dixon did not simply write me off and move on. He viewed my defiance as a personal insult, a breach of contract that required swift correction. He knew the cost of raising a chronically ill child. He knew my savings were finite. He decided to accelerate my breaking point. 3 months into my foster placement, I was summoned to the office of Dr. Aris, the chief medical director of the pediatric clinic where I managed operations. Dr. Aris was a kind man, but that morning he refused to meet my gaze. He stared at a spreadsheet on his desk, his hands clasped tightly together. He informed me that the regional hospital network was implementing an unexpected budget restructuring. My administrative department faced immediate downsizing. My salary would be reduced by 40%, and my health insurance benefits, the very benefits keeping Leo alive, were slated for a steep tier reduction. I asked for the rationale behind the sudden cuts, considering our clinic had exceeded revenue targets for 3 consecutive quarters. Dr. Aris swallowed hard. He adjusted his glasses and admitted that the directive came directly from the advisory board. The Regional Hospital Network Advisory Board, the same board my father had chaired for the last decade. The strategy was breathtaking in its cruelty. Richard Dixon was using his philanthropic leverage to squeeze my employer, knowing the clinic relied on his donor network to fund their expansion. He orchestrated the budget cuts to target my specific role. He wanted to starve me out. He calculated that the mounting copays, the cost of specialized formula, and the sheer financial terror of navigating the healthcare system alone would break my resolve. He expected me to call him, begging for a bailout, ready to return the baby to the state in exchange for my old life. The message was clear: lose the job, lose the kid. Return to the fold, or drown. I sat in Dr. Aris's office and felt a cold, hard clarity replace the panic. I did not resign. I did not call my father. I accepted the pay cut. To compensate, I picked up weekend shifts doing remote medical billing for a telehealth company. I canceled subscriptions, sold my modest jewelry collection, and learned how to stretch a bag of groceries across 2 weeks. I poured every available cent into Leo's care. My father's attempt to bankrupt me achieved the exact opposite of his intention. It severed any lingering guilt I held over leaving the family. It forged an unbreakable bond between me and the boy sleeping in the crib. Every time I paid a medical bill with my depleted checking account, I bought another piece of my own independence. But grit and budgeting could only cover the financial toll. The medical reality of Leo's condition remained a looming threat. By the end of his first year, the standard asthma protocols were failing to provide sustained relief. His pulmonologist grew concerned about underlying autoimmune complications that could be exacerbating the respiratory distress. To chart a safer treatment path, the medical team required a comprehensive genetic history. They needed to know what ghosts hid in his bloodline. Because I was now on the precipice of finalizing the adoption, the state granted me permission to request the sealed intake files from Child Protective Services. I submitted the paperwork asking for whatever redacted medical history they possessed on the biological mother and the unknown father. I drove to the municipal building on a rainy Thursday to collect the cardboard banker's box containing the sparse, tragic remnants of the woman who gave birth to my son. I expected to find old clinic receipts, maybe a scribbled family tree, or a standard state health questionnaire. I had no idea that opening that dusty cardboard lid would hand me the exact weapon I needed to tear my father's empire to the ground. The cardboard banker's box sat on my kitchen counter for 2 days before I gathered the courage to open it. It was sealed with heavy packing tape, bearing a municipal evidence sticker across the seam. Inside rested the sparse, tangible legacy of a woman who had existed, struggled, and vanished, leaving behind only a sick child and a pile of paperwork. The state had bundled her personal effects from the night she passed away. As her son's soon-to-be legal guardian, these items now belonged to me in trust. It was a Saturday morning. Rain lashed against the glass of my patio doors, blurring the outline of the pine trees outside. Leo was asleep in his crib, the nebulizer machine humming its low, steady rhythm down the hall. I made a cup of black coffee, took a deep breath, and sliced through the packing tape with a utility knife. The scent of stale tobacco and cheap vanilla perfume drifted up from the cardboard. The box contained very little of value: a stack of heavily redacted medical forms, a threadbare wool scarf, a cracked leather wallet containing an expired bus pass, and $22 in wrinkled bills. A cheap plastic beaded bracelet. The state had blackened out her last name, her address, and any identifying markers of her extended relatives, adhering to the strict privacy laws surrounding closed adoptions resulting from maternal death. I sifted through the documents first. The intake sheet from the night of her overdose listed her as a 21-year-old female. The cause of death was confirmed as acute opioid toxicity. My chest tightened as I read the clinical, unfeeling description of a life ending. I flipped to the section concerning the biological father. The space designated for his name, contact information, and medical history was completely empty. A single, heavy black line had been drawn through the entire block. She had refused to name him. I set the paperwork aside, feeling a surge of frustration. The pulmonologist needed answers I could not provide. Without a genetic baseline, charting Leo's treatment felt like navigating a minefield in the dark. I turned my attention to the remaining items in the box, hoping to find a crumpled prescription receipt or an old clinic card. At the bottom of the cardboard lay a small, zippered cosmetic bag. The fabric was faded floral print, stained with foundation powder. I unzipped it, pulling out a dried tube of mascara and a half-empty bottle of lip gloss. My fingers brushed against something cold and solid, wedged tightly into the inner lining. I pulled it out. It was a money clip. It was solid, sterling silver, heavy, and cool against my palm. It carried a distinct brushed finish. The design was not a generic store-bought item. It was a custom piece. My breath hitched, stalling in my throat. I carried the clip over to the window, letting the gray morning light fall across the metal surface. Engraved deeply into the lower right corner were 3 initials: S.R.D. Spencer Richard Dixon. A sharp electric shock traveled down my spine. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I stared at the engraved letters, the silver surface reflecting my own pale, terrified face. The clip was unmistakable. It was a graduation gift from my father to Spencer. My brother carried it everywhere. He considered it a talisman of his success. I vividly remembered the frantic Sunday dinner a little over a year ago when Spencer realized it was missing. He had torn through his coat pockets, cursed at the serving staff, and blamed the dry cleaner. He claimed he must have dropped it during a campaign strategy meeting. He did not drop it at a strategy meeting. He left it in the cosmetic bag of a 21-year-old girl who later died alone in a cheap motel room. My hands began to shake. I set the money clip down on the granite counter as if it were coated in acid. I backed away, pressing my spine against the refrigerator. The humming of the nebulizer machine down the hall sounded deafeningly loud. A memory sharp and uninvited clawed its way to the surface of my mind. 10 years ago, during Spencer's sophomore year of college, a quiet scandal had erupted inside our estate. A local girl from the poorer side of the county had shown up at our wrought iron gates pregnant and crying. My father had intercepted her before she reached the front door. He ushered her into his private study. The door remained locked for 3 hours. When she emerged, her face was blank, and her hands clutched a thick, unmarked envelope. My father had paid her off. He arranged for her to leave the state, protecting Spencer's pristine academic record and his future political viability. Richard Dixon had swept the entire incident under the rug, purchasing a clean slate with a fraction of his real estate wealth. It was the Dixon way. You bury your mistakes beneath a mountain of cash. The pattern clicked into place with terrifying mathematical precision. Spencer had repeated his history. He found another vulnerable girl. He engaged in a reckless affair. When she got pregnant, he utilized the family playbook. But this time, the girl did not leave the state. She descended into addiction. She gave birth, suffered a fatal overdose, and the state intervened, placing the infant into the foster system. The out-of-state stray. The bureaucratic transfer. The lie I had spun to protect the child from my family's elitist judgment. I walked slowly down the hallway, stopping in the doorway of the nursery. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a nightlight. Leo slept on his back, his chest rising and falling in time with the hissing mist of the oxygen mask. I looked at his sharp jawline. I looked at the specific, pale slope of his forehead. I thought of the icy blue eyes hidden beneath his sleeping lids and the identical rhythm of his asthmatic breathing. The child fighting for his life in a borrowed municipal crib was not a stranger. He was not a random ward of the state. He was my own biological nephew. He was the direct male heir to the Dixon Empire, discarded and left to suffocate in the foster system, while his father campaigned on a platform of protecting Montana's youth. A strange, cold sensation settled over me. It was not panic. It was not grief. It was the chilling, absolute clarity of realizing you are holding a live grenade, and the people who built the explosive have no idea you possess the pin. I returned to the kitchen. I picked up the silver money clip, placing it into a clear plastic sandwich bag. I needed more than a monogrammed piece of jewelry to destroy a state senate campaign and shatter my father's untouchable legacy. A money clip was circumstantial evidence. A slick lawyer could spin it as a theft. Spencer could claim the girl stole it from his coat pocket at a public event. I needed irrefutable objective proof. I needed the indisputable science of genetics. I needed Spencer's DNA, and I knew exactly how to get it without raising a single suspicion. All I had to do was attend the very family event they had spent the last year hoping I would crawl back and beg to join. Accusing a prominent political figure of abandoning a dying woman and a sick infant is not a task you undertake with a silver money clip and a hunch. In my father's world, wealth buys exceptional legal defense. If I marched into a courtroom or a newspaper office with nothing but an engraved piece of metal found in a deceased addict's makeup bag, the Dixon lawyers would bury me. They would spin a narrative of a jealous, estranged sister trying to extort her successful brother. They would question my mental stability. They would secure a gag order, and I would lose my job, my reputation, and my son. I needed unassailable, objective science. I needed the indisputable authority of genetic testing. 2 days after finding the money clip, a discreet cardboard package arrived at my condo. I had ordered a premium, legally admissible paternity kit from a private laboratory in California. The instructions were simple. I needed a buccal swab from Leo, which was easy enough to obtain while he slept. The second component required a viable DNA sample from the alleged father. The laboratory manual suggested hair follicles with the root attached, nail clippings, or saliva harvested from a recently used beverage container. The universe, with its dark sense of irony, provided the perfect opportunity that very same week. An embossed, cream-colored envelope appeared in my mailbox. It was an invitation to my father's 65th birthday dinner at the estate. Under normal circumstances, I would have thrown the heavy cardstock straight into the recycling bin. I had not set foot on Dixon property since the night of the ultimatum. But the timing was too precise to ignore. I arranged for my coworker Sarah to watch Leo for the evening, layered on a modest navy dress, and drove my aging sedan up the winding, pine-lined driveway of my childhood home. The imposing stone facade of the house loomed against the twilight sky. I parked near the garages, gripping the steering wheel for a moment to steady my pulse. Inside my leather purse rested a sterile, medical-grade plastic bag. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the foyer. The familiar scent of polished hardwood, expensive floral arrangements, and roasting garlic washed over me. The low murmur of conversation drifted from the formal dining room. I handed my coat to the housekeeper and walked toward the archway. My arrival caused a palpable shift in the room's atmosphere. My sister Vanessa paused mid-sentence, her champagne glass hovering near her chin. My mother Diane wore a stiff, frozen smile, her eyes darting over my inexpensive dress. At the head of the table, my father leaned back in his custom-upholstered chair. A distinct look of smug satisfaction settled across his features. Richard Dixon calculated that his financial siege had finally worked. He assumed the pay cut at the clinic and the crushing medical bills had broken my spirit. He looked at me with the quiet triumph of a general watching a starved enemy soldier crawl back to the gates, asking for rations. I offered a polite, subdued greeting, playing the exact role of the defeated daughter he expected to see. I took the only empty seat at the table. It was located directly across from my brother Spencer and his new fiancée, Claire. This was my first time meeting Claire in person. She hailed from a prominent old money family in Helena. She radiated a quiet, effortless elegance, wearing minimal makeup and a simple emerald pendant. Unlike my relatives, Claire possessed a genuine warmth. She smiled at me, asking polite questions about my work at the clinic. She was intelligent, sincere, and entirely oblivious to the rot hiding beneath the polished veneer of the family she was about to marry into. Spencer treated her like a prized acquisition, resting his hand on the back of her chair to project the image of a protective, devoted partner. Dinner proceeded with agonizing slowness. I pushed the roasted lamb around my porcelain plate, keeping my contributions to the conversation brief and agreeable. My focus remained fixed on Spencer's place setting. My brother possessed a very specific set of pretentious habits. He refused to drink the standard coffee brewed by the estate kitchen. Instead, he always brought his own artisan dark roast from a boutique downtown cafe served in a thick, branded paper cup with a plastic lid. That cup currently sat inches from his right hand. I watched him lift it, take a slow sip, and set it back down on the linen tablecloth. He left a distinct wet ring of saliva on the rim of the plastic lid. There it was, the key to the entire fortress, sitting right in front of me. As the dessert plates were cleared, Spencer tapped his silver spoon against his crystal water goblet. The ringing sound commanded the attention of the room. He stood up, buttoning the jacket of his tailored suit. He directed his bright, engineered smile toward our father. Dad Spencer began, his voice rich, and practiced the tone of a man used to speaking into microphones. Tonight, we celebrate your legacy. You built this family on a foundation of hard work, loyalty, and an unwavering commitment to the community. You taught me that true wealth is not measured in property, but in the values we uphold and the vulnerable people we protect. I took a slow sip of my ice water. The cool liquid did nothing to quench the dry heat rising in my throat. Spencer turned his gaze toward Claire, his expression softening into a mask of pure, rehearsed devotion. And as Claire and I prepare for our upcoming wedding, and as I move forward with this Senate campaign, I carry those lessons with me. My platform is built on those very ideals. We are going to reform the foster care system in this state. We are going to ensure that no child falls through the cracks and that every vulnerable family receives the support they need to thrive. To family and to the future. Hear, hear, my father grunted, raising his glass. The entire table echoed the sentiment, the crystal glasses chiming together in a chorus of profound hypocrisy. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting in my lap. The dramatic irony was so thick it felt heavy in my lungs. I looked at my brother pontificating about vulnerable youth and family values. I thought about the cheap motel room. I thought about the 21-year-old girl dying alone with his silver money clip hidden in her makeup bag. I thought about Leo struggling for breath under a plastic oxygen mask in the middle of the night while his biological father stood in a multi-million-dollar dining room drinking expensive wine and soliciting campaign donations on his behalf. I did not glare at him. I raised my own glass and offered a polite nod. Let him boast. Let him feel invincible. Arrogance is a sedative, and my family was deeply asleep. Following the toast, my mother ushered everyone into the adjoining parlor for birthday cake and cocktails. The transition was chaotic. Vanessa complained about her heels. My father debated a golf score with a business partner who had just arrived, and Spencer guided Claire toward the grand piano. I lingered in the dining room for exactly 4 seconds. The serving staff had not yet cleared the far end of the table. Spencer's paper coffee cup remained abandoned next to his crumpled linen napkin. I stepped forward, my movements fluid and silent. I opened my leather purse, unsealing the medical-grade plastic bag. Using the edge of my own napkin to avoid contaminating the evidence, I grasped the base of the paper cup and dropped it straight into the sterile bag. I pressed the plastic seal closed, trapping his saliva and his genetic code inside. I dropped the napkin, smoothed the front of my navy dress, and walked calmly into the parlor to join the celebration. I stayed for another 40 minutes, offering polite smiles and enduring my father's patronizing advice about responsible budgeting. When I finally claimed fatigue and requested my coat, nobody tried to stop me from leaving. They bid me farewell with the dismissive courtesy reserved for the hired help. I walked out to my aging sedan, the gravel crunching under my shoes. I started the engine, waiting for the heater to warm the cabin. I reached into my purse, running my fingertips over the smooth plastic bag containing the discarded coffee cup. I had the DNA. Within 10 days, the laboratory would confirm the biological link between the golden heir and the discarded stray. But as I drove down the dark, winding road away from the estate, a new, unsettling question began to surface. The money clip proved Spencer knew the girl. The DNA would prove he fathered the child. But those two pieces of evidence did not explain the mechanics of her death. How did a local girl end up dying in a rundown motel on the edge of the county line? Why did she have his money clip on the exact night she overdosed? Proving paternity was enough to cause a scandal, but it was not enough to guarantee my father would not fight me for custody. To build an impenetrable fortress around my son, I needed to know the exact circumstances of that fatal night. I needed to know who owned the ground she died on. The next morning, while Leo took his nap, I logged into the county property tax database. What I found waiting in those public records would shift my mission from a quiet defense into a full-scale demolition. I mailed the sealed plastic bag containing Spencer's discarded coffee cup via certified overnight express the morning after the birthday dinner. The laboratory in California required a standard processing window of 7 to 10 business days. During that waiting period, the silence in my condo felt charged, like the heavy static air preceding a summer thunderstorm. I continued my daily routine at the pediatric clinic, navigating the budget cuts my father had engineered with quiet efficiency. I brought my lunch in a reusable container. I wore my older, sensible shoes. I played the part of the struggling, compliant daughter to perfection. But during my lunch breaks, sitting at my small metal desk while the clinic phones rang down the hall, I directed my administrative skills toward a different set of files. The money clip proved Spencer had an intimate connection to the deceased girl. The forthcoming DNA results would confirm his paternity. But my father, Richard Dixon, possessed the financial resources and the political leverage to spin even biological facts. He could hire a public relations firm to frame Spencer as a tragic victim, claiming my brother engaged in a brief relationship but had no knowledge of the resulting pregnancy or the mother's subsequent demise. They would paint him as a noble, grieving father who only discovered his lost son through my fortunate intervention. They would use that narrative to justify seizing custody of Leo, ensuring the Dixon heir returned to the estate. I needed to sever that potential defense. I needed to prove Spencer knew about the child before the overdose, and I needed to understand the mechanics of the mother's death. I began with the sparse information provided in the state intake file. The document listed the address where the paramedics found her body. It was a motel called the Whispering Pines, located on the far western edge of the county. The property was notorious among local healthcare workers. It functioned as a derelict transient housing complex, a dead end for people battling addiction and poverty. It was the exact type of establishment local politicians promised to clean up during election season, only to ignore once they took office. I logged into the county property tax assessor's public database. The portal was clunky, requiring specific parcel numbers to retrieve ownership records. I typed in the address for the Whispering Pines. The screen loaded, displaying a grid of bleak, bureaucratic data. The listed owner was not an individual. It was an entity registered as Blue Ridge Holdings Limited Liability Company. I recognized the naming convention immediately. My father utilized a labyrinth of shell corporations to manage the less glamorous, high-yield properties in his real estate portfolio. He preferred to keep the prestigious Dixon name attached to the luxury developments in the downtown retail centers, while burying the profitable slum properties under obscure corporate titles. I opened a secondary browser tab and navigated to the Montana Secretary of State Business Registry. I searched for Blue Ridge Holdings. The corporate filing loaded, detailing the registered agent and the mailing address for tax purposes. The mailing address matched a post office box located 3 blocks from my father's corporate headquarters. The registered agent on file was a man named Arthur Vance. Arthur Vance was my father's senior legal counsel. A cold sensation washed over me, chilling the skin on my arms, despite the warm air circulating through the clinic office. The biological mother of my son did not overdose in a random forgotten alley. She died on property effectively owned and managed by Richard Dixon. The implications were staggering. If my father owned the property, he controlled the security, the management, and the flow of information. It meant the family was not blind to her existence. They had contained her. They had placed her in a controlled environment, out of the public eye, far away from Spencer's pristine campaign trail. I needed a timeline. I needed to know if Spencer had made direct contact with her before she died. I pulled up the clinic's internal scheduling and security logs. As the operations manager, I possessed high-level clearance for the facility's security systems, including the exterior camera feeds from our primary care building. The intake file stated the mother passed away on the 14th of November. I set the security software parameters to filter footage from the front entrance and the secondary parking lot during the second week of November. The process was tedious, requiring me to scrub through hours of mundane footage showing patients arriving and staff members taking coffee breaks. On the afternoon of November 10th, 4 days prior to her death, the camera feed covering the secondary parking lot captured a familiar vehicle. It was a sleek, black, luxury SUV with custom-tinted windows. The license plate was partially obscured by mud, but the distinct aftermarket rims were unmistakable. It was Spencer's vehicle. I watched the grainy black and white footage play out on my monitor. The SUV idled near the edge of the asphalt for 20 minutes. Finally, a young woman emerged from the side door of the clinic. She walked with a slow, unsteady gait, wearing an oversized coat that failed to hide the obvious signs of advanced pregnancy. She approached the passenger side of the SUV. The tinted window rolled down. The camera angle did not capture Spencer's face, but it captured his arm reaching out. He handed her a thick, white envelope. She took it, nodding briefly, before turning away and walking toward the nearby bus stop. The SUV immediately reversed out of the parking lot and sped away. I paused the video feed. I took a screenshot of the exchange and saved the file to an encrypted external drive. The narrative my family might try to spin was now completely dead. The footage proved Spencer met with her in the final days of her pregnancy. He saw her physical state. He handed her an envelope likely filled with cash, utilizing the exact same payoff tactic our father had employed 10 years ago. He knew she was pregnant. He knew she was vulnerable. He paid her to remain quiet, and he drove away, leaving her to return to a derelict motel owned by his own family. 4 days later, she was dead, and his son entered the foster system. He abandoned them both to protect his political future. The sheer depth of the depravity left me feeling hollow. I closed the security software and shut down my computer. I walked out of the clinic that evening carrying a heavy, terrifying truth. I was no longer just fighting for custody. I was holding the evidence of a profound, calculated moral failure that implicated the two most powerful men in my family. 3 days later, I was standing in my kitchen preparing a bottle of specialized formula for Leo when the mail carrier dropped a stack of envelopes through the front door slot. I walked over to the entryway, sorting through the utility bills and the junk mail circulars. Near the bottom of the stack rested a stiff, white priority envelope bearing the return address of the private California laboratory. My heart hammered against my ribs. I set the rest of the mail on the entry table. I carried the priority envelope to the kitchen island. I did not use a utility knife. I tore the thick paper open with my bare hands. Inside was a single sheet of heavy, watermarked paper. The lab report was dense with medical terminology, genetic markers, and statistical algorithms. I skipped past the methodology and the allele charts, dragging my index finger down the page until I reached the final, bolded conclusion at the bottom. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. The numbers seemed to vibrate on the page. The science was absolute. The objective proof I needed was finally resting in my hands. The paper confirmed what the money clip, the blue eyes, and the asthma had already whispered in the dark. I walked down the hall to the nursery. Leo was awake, standing at the edge of his crib, gripping the wooden rails with his small hands. He offered a wide, gummy smile when I entered the room. I reached down and lifted him into my arms, pressing my face into his soft, warm neck. He smelled like baby powder and clean laundry. He was safe. He was loved. And he was legally, biologically, deeply entwined in the very family that had thrown him away. I carried Leo back to the kitchen. I retrieved a thick manila envelope from my home office desk. I placed the certified DNA results inside. I added a printed copy of the property tax records linking my father to the motel. I added the USB drive containing the security footage of Spencer handing over the payoff envelope. Finally, I dropped the custom engraved silver money clip into the bottom. I sealed the brass clasp on the back of the envelope. The trap was now fully constructed, loaded with enough factual ammunition to shatter the Dixon legacy into unrecoverable pieces. But I could not detonate the weapon yet. The finalization hearing at the courthouse was still 10 days away. If I confronted them now, my father would leverage his legal team to halt the adoption process, trapping Leo in state custody while they fought for biological rights. I needed them to remain blind and arrogant. I needed to legally paralyze them, ensuring they explicitly forfeited any claim to the child before they ever learned his true identity. I needed to bait the trap with their own elitism. The sealed manila envelope sat locked inside the fireproof safe in my bedroom closet, but physical evidence alone offered no true protection. In the realm of family law, biology wields a heavy, dangerous sword. If my father discovered the truth before the judge struck his gavel, he would flood the court system with emergency injunctions. Richard Dixon possessed enough capital to hire an entire floor of ruthless litigators. They would file immediate motions, citing fraud, petitioning for temporary custody of his newly discovered grandson, while the courts untangled the mess. I would spend the next 5 years drowning in legal fees. I would lose my home, my savings, and my sanity, fighting a war of attrition. Worse, Leo would be ripped from the only stable environment he had ever known. He would grow up isolated behind the wrought iron gates of the estate, raised by the very people who drove his mother into the ground. They would mold him into another cold, calculating heir, continuing the cycle of damage. I needed a shield, a preemptive strike executed under the guise of daughterly desperation. I needed the patriarch to formally, explicitly reject the boy in writing, creating a documented trail of abandonment. The trap had to appeal to his towering pride. My father operates on a predictable matrix of ego and dominance. If I presented the request as a final emotional plea for inclusion, his vanity would compel him to crush it. He would view the message as a victory, a final confirmation that his financial siege had reduced me to begging. I sat at my small kitchen desk and opened my laptop. The cursor blinked against a blank white document. Crafting the message required a delicate, precise balance. It needed to sound like the surrender of a broken woman, yet contain the specific terminology of a legal waiver. Every syllable had to serve a dual purpose. I typed slow, deliberate keystrokes. Before I finalize this adoption tomorrow morning, I am reaching out one last time. I want to know if our family claims any ties, rights, or interest in this child. If there is any place for him in our legacy, please tell me now. Otherwise, I will proceed alone. I read the lines aloud in the quiet kitchen. The phrasing was airtight. It offered them an open door while reinforcing the fabricated narrative of the out-of-state transfer. Blinded by their own deep-seated prejudice, they would never suspect the snare hidden beneath the sentiment. They believed they were swatting away a beggar. They did not realize they were signing a permanent abdication. I addressed the message to both my father and Spencer. I clicked send. The waiting began. I closed the laptop and walked into the living room, listening to the rain tap against the glass patio doors. I anticipated a delay, perhaps a full day of silence designed to let me suffer in suspense. It was a common tactic in the Dixon playbook, letting the opponent sweat before delivering the final verdict. I underestimated my father's eagerness to deliver a killing blow. My phone chimed with an incoming notification exactly 17 minutes later. The response came directly from Richard's private corporate address. Spencer was copied on the thread. I unlocked the screen, my pulse beating a steady, rhythmic cadence against my collarbone. I opened the message. The text was brief, devoid of any greeting or familial warmth. It read like a corporate dismissal. We have no ties to that child. The Dixon family forfeits any association with your charity case. Do not contact us regarding this matter again. You made your choice. A deep, profound exhale left my lungs, carrying the weight of the last 14 months with it. He had done it. He had handed me a written, time-stamped forfeiture of interest drafted from his own verified account. The phrasing was harsh, but the legal implication was pristine. By using the word forfeits, he explicitly waived any future claim. By calling him a charity case, he documented his own dismissive negligence. I took a screenshot of the exchange. I forwarded the chain to my personal encrypted server, ensuring the record survived even if my phone sustained damage. I printed 3 hard copies, placing one inside the safe with the DNA results and packing the other 2 into my leather tote bag. The legal high ground was secure. The fortress was built. The tension that had gripped my shoulders for weeks finally began to dissolve. I walked down the hallway to the nursery to prepare Leo for bed. The evening routine offered a quiet sanctuary away from the calculating chess match I was playing against my own blood. I carried him into the bathroom and turned the brass faucet, letting the warm water fill the shallow plastic tub. Steam rose, fogging the mirror above the sink and warming the cool tile. I stripped away his clothes, lifting his fragile body into the water. He splashed his hands, sending warm droplets scattering across the floor, offering a bright, toothless smile. I poured a small amount of lavender soap onto a soft cotton washcloth. I gently scrubbed his shoulders, his arms, and his back, mindful of the lingering fragility in his chest. The scent of the soap filled the small room, grounding me in the present moment. Here was a life vibrant and breathing, entirely dependent on my care. As I rinsed the suds from his neck, I brushed his damp blonde hair forward. The movement exposed the pale, smooth skin just behind his left ear. My hand stopped. The washcloth hovered above the water. There, resting just above the hairline, sat a distinct, crescent-shaped birthmark. It was small, no larger than a fingerprint, but the curvature was unmistakable. It looked like a tiny, pale shadow stamped into the dermis. My breath stalled. I traced the edge of the mark with my thumb, feeling the slight difference in texture. Growing up in that sprawling estate, I had seen that exact same crescent 1,000 times. I remembered tracing it on Spencer's neck when we were toddlers playing in the garden. I remembered seeing it on my father's skin when he sat in his leather reading chair. My grandfather possessed the same mark. It was a genetic stamp, an indelible signature passed down through generations of men in our lineage. It was the physical manifestation of the bloodline they prized above all earthly possessions. The profound, suffocating irony of the moment washed over me. I stared at the tiny crescent on the neck of a boy they had just casually discarded in an email. The men who shared this mark had just signed away their legacy. They abandoned their own flesh, blinded by their obsession with status and their unyielding arrogance. I lifted Leo from the water, wrapping him in a thick hooded towel. I pulled him tight against my chest, breathing in the clean scent of his skin. The final piece of the puzzle was locked into place. The trap was baited, set, and legally reinforced. Tomorrow morning we would visit the courthouse to finalize the decree. The gavel would fall, cementing my guardianship. And tomorrow afternoon, following the hearing, we would celebrate our new life at a specific restaurant in downtown Missoula. I had selected the venue with surgical precision, right in the center of Spencer's campaign trail, where the architects of this tragedy would finally be forced to look their discarded heir in the eyes. The sharp crack of Judge Miller's wooden mallet still resonated in my memory as we descended the wide concrete steps of the municipal building. The morning frost had melted, leaving the streets damp and gray. It was exactly 1 hour after the legal proceeding from earlier that morning. My son was now a Dixon by law, shielded by the impenetrable armor of a state decree. Mark carried the heavy diaper bag. Sarah held the glass door open. They were administrative staff from the clinic, but over the grueling trial of the past 14 months, they had morphed into my authentic support system. They had covered my operational shifts when Leo spiked a fever. They had brought hot meals when my bank account hovered near zero following my father's orchestrated budget cuts. They believed we were simply treating ourselves to a rare, expensive lunch to mark a joyous occasion. They had no idea I was steering our small group directly into a meticulously calculated collision. I drove us toward the historic district of downtown Missoula. We parked 2 blocks from the Silver Line Bistro. This establishment did not cater to casual diners. It boasted exposed brick walls, imported Italian chandeliers, and a menu where prices were conspicuously absent. It served as the unofficial headquarters for the local elite. Real estate developers closed deals over plates of seared venison. Politicians traded favors while sipping aged bourbon. It was the exact type of environment my parents considered their natural habitat. I did not pick this restaurant for its culinary reputation. I selected it with the cold precision of a military tactician. Today was Tuesday. My brother's public itinerary was easy to track through local press releases. Before we left the condo that morning, I paid special attention to dressing Leo. I bypassed the standard cotton onesies and comfortable play clothes. Instead, I selected a finely knit cerulean blue sweater. The garment possessed a rich, saturated hue. I paired it with dark trousers and soft leather walking shoes. The color of the knit fabric was not a random choice. It functioned as a visual magnet. It caught the ambient restaurant light and drew immediate attention upward, framing his face and illuminating his irises. The sweater made his icy blue eyes look startlingly bright. It turned the undeniable genetic signature of his biological father into a physical beacon. We pushed through the heavy glass entrance of the Silver Line. The air inside smelled of roasted garlic truffle oil and expensive espresso. The low hum of affluent conversation filled the dining room. The hostess stood behind a polished mahogany podium. She recognized me instantly. Her posture stiffened. She knew my family. Everyone in this zip code knew my family. She also knew I had been conspicuously absent from their recent high-profile gatherings. I requested a table for 3 adults and 1 high chair. I specifically asked for the semi-private alcove located along the eastern wall. The hostess hesitated, glancing nervously toward the center of the room. But she gathered a stack of leather-bound menus and led us through the maze of white tablecloths. The alcove offered a strategic vantage point. It was elevated by a single step surrounded by low mahogany partitions. It provided a clear, unobstructed sightline of the main floor, while offering a degree of physical separation. I settled into the plush booth, sliding Leo into the wooden high chair at the head of our table. I looked across the dining room. Sitting exactly where the local society columns predicted, less than 40 feet away, was my brother. Spencer occupied the premier center table. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his posture exuding a relaxed, engineered confidence. Beside him sat his fiancée, Claire, looking elegant in a beige silk blouse. Across from them sat Claire's parents, wealthy benefactors whose financial approval Spencer desperately needed to secure his political war chest. Rounding out the group was a prominent journalist from the state capitol, a reporter known for crafting glowing profiles of rising conservative stars. I watched my brother lean forward, resting his forearms on the table. He gestured with open palms, projecting the image of a humble public servant. He was undoubtedly pitching his platform, weaving tales of family preservation and moral duty. He smiled his polished, camera-ready smile. He looked invincible. He looked like a man who believed all his past transgressions were permanently buried in the frozen dirt of a transient motel. Sarah picked up her menu, whispering a joke about the exorbitant cost of the appetizers. Mark poured water into our glasses, oblivious to the high-stakes theater playing out across the room. I took a slow sip from my glass. The ice clinked softly. My pulse did not race. My palms remained dry. A year ago, being in the same room as my brother would have triggered a suffocating wave of anxiety. I would have lowered my head, hoping to escape unnoticed. Today, I felt nothing but a cold, measured tranquility. I possessed the signed court decree in my bag. I possessed the private laboratory results, the property tax records, and the security footage inside a thick envelope. I was not the black sheep sneaking into the pasture. I was the architect of the trap, sitting quietly while the prey enjoyed his final meal. We ordered our food. Leo chewed on a piece of soft bread, his bright blue eyes scanning the unfamiliar environment. The blue sweater worked perfectly, making him look like a miniature, undeniable portrait of the man sitting 40 feet away. I waited for Spencer to casually glance in our direction. I wanted him to see the ghost of his past sitting in the flesh. I wanted the realization to seep into his bones before I ever uttered a word. But the first strike did not come from the center table. The dynamic of the room shifted subtly. The hostess, stationed at the front entrance, stepped aside with a wide, deferential smile. The heavy glass doors swung open again. My mother, Diane, walked into the bistro, flanked by my father, Richard, and my sister, Vanessa. They were not scheduled to attend Spencer's campaign lunch. They were here for their own midday social hour. My father handed his cashmere coat to the attendant, adjusting his expensive watch. My mother scanned the dining room to locate her golden son. Instead, her eyes swept past the center table and locked directly onto my alcove. The temperature in my immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. My parents had spent the morning actively boycotting the legal formation of my family, hiding behind their pride. Now seeing me sitting in their territory, looking unbothered and content, I watched the indignation flash across my father's features. The collision I had orchestrated was about to begin earlier than anticipated. They were marching straight toward my table, unaware that the cage doors had already locked behind them. The approach was deliberate and aggressive. My father led the charge, his heavy footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of the dining room. My mother walked half a pace behind him, her posture rigid, her chin elevated. My sister Vanessa trailed them both, holding her smartphone, already scanning the room for familiar faces who might witness the interaction. They did not march over to my alcove because they regretted their absence at the courthouse. They approached because my father could not tolerate a scenario he did not control. Richard Dixon operated on a simple principle. If a family member existed in a public space, they existed as a reflection of his brand. Seeing me dining with my clinic staff and a ward of the state in his preferred establishment was an unacceptable breach of decorum. But as they closed the distance, my mother noticed the occupants of the center table. She saw Spencer, More importantly, she saw the capital city journalist sitting across from him. The reporter had a digital voice recorder resting near his water glass and a notebook open on the table. I watched Diane's expression shift in a fraction of a second. The cold, aristocratic disdain dissolved into an expression of profound, fabricated warmth. She tapped my father's arm, muttering a quick instruction under her breath. The hostile confrontation was instantly canceled, replaced by a live performance designed for the press. If the reporter witnessed a fracture in the Dixon family, Spencer's campaign would suffer. They needed to present a united front. They needed to play the role of the benevolent, tolerant patriarchs, extending an olive branch to a troubled, wayward daughter. They breached the low partition of our alcove uninvited. My co-workers, Sarah and Mark, fell silent. They both instinctively sat back in their chairs, recognizing the abrupt change in atmospheric pressure. "Norah, darling," my mother cooed. Her voice possessed an artificial sweetness that grated against my ears. It was loud. It was pitched to carry across the dining room, ensuring the journalist caught the frequency of her manufactured affection. She leaned down, pressing her powdered cheek against my own. I did not lean into the embrace. I remained perfectly rigid. "We were so surprised to see you here today," she continued, standing back up and smoothing the lapels of her cashmere cardigan. "We thought you would be resting after your busy morning." My father stood tall beside her, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. He offered a tight, patronizing nod. He did not look at Leo. His eyes remained fixed on my face, issuing a silent warning to play along with the theater. Vanessa tapped away on her phone, bored by the interaction, clearly viewing my presence as a tedious interruption to her afternoon. "It has been a productive morning," I replied, my voice level and calm. "The legal proceedings concluded without a single complication. I am celebrating with my team." Diane placed a manicured hand over her heart, adopting the expression of a long-suffering martyr. "Oh, sweetheart, you know we worry about you. We worry about the massive burden you have placed upon your own shoulders. But we want you to know that despite your choices, we will always keep a place for you. We are family." She turned slightly, ensuring her profile was visible to the center table. She was giving a masterclass in passive aggression, painting my adoption of an orphaned child as a tragic character flaw that required her saintly forgiveness. To complete the performance, Diane reached into her expensive leather handbag. She pulled out a small cellophane-wrapped package and set it down on the white tablecloth next to my sparkling water. "We brought a little something," she said, her smile wide and unblinking. "A peace offering. We know things have been tense, but we wanted to show our support for the poor thing." I looked down at the table. The item inside the cellophane wrapper was a cheap plastic rattle. It possessed garish primary colors and thin molded handles. It looked like an afterthought, something grabbed from a pharmacy checkout aisle on the drive over. It was an insulting gesture, a physical manifestation of her disdain disguised as a gift. She had not selected it with care. She had purchased a prop to complete her public relations stunt. I did not thank her. I did not express gratitude for the olive branch. I picked up the plastic package. I turned it over in my hands, examining the back of the cardboard backing. My mother watched me, her artificial smile faltering slightly at the edges. She expected me to tuck it away quickly. She expected compliance. I found the small printed warning label near the barcode. I tapped my index finger against the bold black text. "I appreciate the gesture, Mother," I said, maintaining a conversational, pleasant tone. "But I cannot accept this." Diane stiffened. "And why is that, Norah?" I slid the package back across the white linen, stopping it exactly in front of her manicured fingers. "Because the manufacturer clearly notes this item presents a severe choking hazard. It is explicitly labeled as not safe for children under 3 years of age. Leo is 14 months old. Giving this to him would be dangerous." The silence in the alcove was sudden and absolute. Sarah covered her mouth to hide a sharp intake of breath. Mark looked down at his plate. I delivered the correction without malice, but the impact was devastating. In 3 sentences, I stripped away the facade. I proved to everyone within earshot that Diane Dixon possessed no genuine care for the child. She did not know his age. She did not consider his safety. She cared only about the optics of handing over a wrapped package in front of a journalist. A dark flush of humiliation crept up my mother's neck. Her hand snatched the plastic toy off the table, dropping it back into her handbag with a swift, angry motion. She opened her mouth to issue a sharp reprimand, but the words died in her throat. Because in that exact moment, seeking a distraction from her embarrassment, Diane finally allowed her gaze to drop. For the first time since walking into the restaurant, she looked directly at the child sitting in the high chair. She looked at the boy she had labeled a stray, the boy she had boycotted all morning. Leo was gripping a piece of crusty bread. He turned his head toward the sudden movement of her handbag. The bright blue knit sweater framed his face perfectly. The ambient light of the bistro caught his irises. Diane looked into those icy blue eyes. She noted the sharp, distinct angle of his jawline. The color drained entirely from her face. Her breath hitched, catching violently in the back of her throat. Her manicured fingers gripped the edge of the mahogany partition, her knuckles turning white. She recognized the genetics. She recognized the ghost. And she realized with absolute terror that the boy she had just tried to use as a political prop was the exact heir her family had paid to bury. The transformation was visceral. It did not happen gradually. It hit my mother with the brute force of a physical blow. The artificial maternal warmth she had broadcasted across the dining room vanished, replaced by a hollow, terrified realization. Diane stood frozen beside the table. Her eyes remained locked on the 14-month-old boy sitting in the wooden high chair. Leo dropped his piece of bread. He looked back at her, his expression neutral, tilting his head slightly to the left. The movement shifted the collar of the bright blue knit sweater, exposing the smooth, pale skin of his neck. Right there, resting just above the edge of the fabric, was the crescent-shaped birthmark. Diane let out a short, ragged gasp. Her hand shot up to cover her mouth, muffling a sound that bordered on a sob. My father, annoyed by her sudden loss of composure, frowned. He stepped closer, intending to issue a quiet command to maintain appearances. Diane, he hissed his voice low and tight. Pull yourself together. People are watching. Diane did not answer him. She could not pull her eyes away from the child. She raised a shaking hand and pointed a single, trembling finger toward the high chair. Richard Dixon followed her gaze. He finally looked at the boy he had dismissed in an email just hours prior. He looked at the charity case he had used to justify cutting my salary and decimating my health insurance. I watched the imperious, unyielding patriarch of the Dixon Empire dismantle in real time. The ruddy, confident flush of his cheeks turned the color of wet ash. His jaw slackened. The hard lines around his mouth collapsed. He recognized the icy blue eyes. He saw the exact genetic slope of the forehead. And he saw the undeniable, indelible signature of his own bloodline stamped onto the boy's neck. He knew. The instant his eyes registered those features, the math calculated behind his pupils. He knew his golden son had engaged in another reckless affair. He knew Spencer had utilized the family playbook to discard the pregnant woman. And he knew with chilling certainty that the infant fighting for survival in the foster system was his own biological grandson, the very male heir he had spent his life waiting to groom. A profound, suffocating silence descended upon our side of the partition. The clatter of silverware from adjacent tables and the low hum of the jazz music playing over the restaurant speakers seemed to fade into a distant buzz. The only sound in our immediate vicinity was the ragged, uneven breathing of my parents. Vanessa, still tapping away on her smartphone, finally noticed the strange freeze frame holding her parents captive. She looked up, annoyed. "What is going on?" she demanded, her tone sharp. "Why is everyone staring at the kid?" Neither Richard nor Diane offered an explanation. They could not speak. Speaking would require acknowledging the nightmare unfolding in front of them. It would require admitting that the purity of their bloodline was not a fortress, but a fragile house of cards currently resting in the hands of the daughter they had ostracized. I sat back against the plush upholstery of the booth. I picked up my crystal glass, the condensation cool against my fingertips. I brought the rim to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I offered no assistance. I provided no gentle transition. I did not rush to fill the dead air with a comforting explanation. I simply sat there, allowing the crushing weight of their own hypocrisy to suffocate them. They had built their entire worldview around the superiority of their genetics. They had weaponized their wealth to punish me for diluting their legacy. I wanted them to feel the full, agonizing burn of realizing they had actively boycotted the legal adoption of the exact prize they coveted most. My father gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles strained against his skin. The polished veneer of the untouchable real estate magnate shattered, revealing a man frantic to regain control of a situation that had already spiraled beyond his reach. He leaned across the white tablecloth, closing the distance between us. His voice dropped to a harsh, venomous whisper, ensuring the journalist sitting 40 feet away could not hear the exchange. "Where did you get him?" Richard demanded. His tone carried no warmth, no grandfatherly awe. It held only the aggressive entitlement of a man demanding the return of a stolen asset. I set my glass down. I looked him directly in the eyes. "I got him from the state of Montana, Dad. He was placed in my care 14 months ago." Diane shook her head, tears of panic brimming in her eyes. "No, that is impossible. You told us he was an interstate transfer. You said he came from Nevada." I offered a small, calm smile, the kind of smile a teacher gives a student who finally understands a complex equation. "I said he was a bureaucratic transfer. You assumed he was from Nevada because it fit your narrative. You never bothered to ask for the details. You never bothered to look at his face." My father's breathing turned shallow. The implications of the timeline struck him. He realized I had possessed this knowledge for months. He realized my stoic endurance through the budget cuts, the emergency room visits, and the isolation was not the stubborn resilience of a martyr. It was the quiet, calculated patience of an executioner holding the axe. "You knew," Richard hissed, his voice vibrating with a sudden, intense fury. "You knew whose child this was, and you kept it from us. You engineered this entire charade to humiliate your family." I did not flinch. I kept my voice perfectly level. "I did not engineer anything, Richard. Your son engineered this situation when he abandoned a pregnant girl in a derelict motel. I simply cleaned up the mess he left behind. And as for keeping it from you, I sent you an email last night offering you a final opportunity to claim a place in his life." I watched the memory of that email hit him. I saw him recall the exact phrasing of his blistering reply. He remembered typing the words that permanently forfeited his interest in the child. He realized I had not sent a desperate plea. I had sent a legal snare, and he had stepped directly into it. Before Richard could formulate a counterattack, the dynamic shifted again. The heavy silence around our alcove acted like a vacuum, drawing attention from the surrounding diners. And the most dangerous person in the room finally noticed the disruption. Across the dining room, Spencer excused himself from the center table. He patted his fiancée's shoulder, offered a bright smile to the journalist, and stood up. He assumed his parents were trapped in an awkward social encounter with his estranged sister. He believed he needed to intervene to play the benevolent peacemaker and ensure the press witnessed his diplomatic skills. Spencer began walking toward our alcove, straightening his tie, preparing to deliver a polished, condescending greeting. He was marching blindly into the kill zone, completely unaware that his parents were currently standing in the wreckage of his darkest secret. The distance between the center table and our alcove measured roughly 40 feet. I watched Spencer cover that expanse with the smooth, practiced stride of a man accustomed to owning every room he entered. He moved with a relaxed confidence, his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the plush carpet. He believed he was stepping into a minor, annoying family skirmish. He intended to defuse the situation swiftly, offer a patronizing remark about my charity case, and return to his journalist to discuss his platform on family values. He was not walking alone. Claire, his fiancée, walked half a pace behind him. She carried a sleek clutch purse, her expression polite and curious. She had noticed the sudden rigidity in my parents' posture and wanted to ensure everything was fine. Claire operated on the assumption that she was joining a family of dignified, respectable leaders. She had no idea she was accompanying a man to his own execution. My father saw Spencer approaching. Richard Dixon, a man who built an empire on ruthless negotiation and emotional control, panicked. He raised his hand, a sharp, aborted gesture intended to stop Spencer in his tracks. He knew what would happen if his son looked at the child. He needed to extract the family from the restaurant immediately, before the press caught wind of the unfolding disaster. But Richard could not shout. He could not cause a scene. The very social optics he worshipped now acted as a gag, preventing him from halting the collision. Spencer reached the low mahogany partition. He did not notice the pale, terrified expression on his mother's face. He did not register the white-knuckled grip his father maintained on the edge of the table. Spencer possessed the specific, blinding narcissism of a golden child. He assumed the world revolved entirely around his narrative. "Well, look who decided to join civil society today," Spencer said. His voice was rich, carrying the exact modulation he used during campaign speeches. It sounded warm, yet carried an undercurrent of distinct condescension. He offered me a bright, flawless smile. "I see you finalized the paperwork for your little project. Let us see the newest addition to the state registry." He stepped around his mother, leaning forward slightly to peer over the partition and into the high chair. I did not move. I did not attempt to shield Leo from his view. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on my lap. I watched my brother look down at the boy he had paid to erase. The reaction was instantaneous. Spencer's $1,000,000 smile did not fade gradually. It snapped. The muscles in his face seemed to short-circuit. The practice warmth vanished, replaced by a slack, horrified realization. His eyes widened, locking onto the icy blue irises staring back at him. He saw the distinct angle of the jaw. He saw the crescent birthmark resting just above the collar of the bright blue sweater. For Spencer, the mathematical calculation did not require a DNA test. The visual confirmation triggered an immediate, devastating timeline in his mind. He recognized the age of the child. He knew exactly what he was doing 14 months ago. He remembered the heavy white envelope stuffed with cash. He remembered the tinted windows of his SUV, the rain-slicked asphalt of the clinic parking lot, and the pregnant girl walking away toward the bus stop. He knew exactly whose child he was looking at. Spencer recoiled. The movement was sharp and violent. He stumbled backward, his heel catching against the base of the partition. He threw his hand out, grabbing the edge of the adjacent booth to steady himself. His breath left his lungs in a harsh, audible hiss. "What is this?" Spencer choked out. His voice stripped of all its polished resonance. It sounded thin, reedy, and laced with absolute panic. He looked from the baby to me, his eyes wide and frantic. He expected to find confusion or apology on my face. Instead, he found the cold, unyielding gaze of a woman who had spent the last year holding his oxygen mask. I offered a small, terrifyingly polite nod. "This is Leo Spencer." I said his name clearly, ensuring the syllables carried to the people standing behind him. Claire stepped forward, reaching out to steady Spencer's arm. She felt the violent tremor running through his body. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice laced with genuine concern. "Spencer, what is wrong?" Spencer could not answer her. He could not form a coherent sentence. He stared at the child like he was looking at a ghost materializing in the middle of a crowded dining room. Claire frowned. She was an intelligent woman. She hailed from a family that valued transparency and possessed a sharp instinct for reading social dynamics. She noticed the sweat breaking out on Spencer's forehead. She looked at Diane, who was quietly weeping into a linen napkin, refusing to look at the baby. She looked at Richard, who stood rigid, his face an ashen mask of defeated fury. Then Claire followed their collective gaze. She looked down at the child sitting in the high chair. She saw the icy blue eyes. She saw the familiar sharp slope of the forehead. She noted the specific shade of blonde hair. The puzzle pieces snapped together in her mind. The resemblance was too severe to ignore. It was not a distant familial similarity. It was a direct, undeniable copy. Claire possessed enough medical literacy to understand the genetic implications of the features she was observing. She looked back at Spencer. She saw the sheer terror radiating from him. She realized he was not looking at a stranger. He was looking at his own reflection. "Is this?" Claire started, her voice dropping to a low, guarded tone. "Spencer, whose child is this?" Spencer opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He desperately needed a lie, a slick political spin to explain away the impossible situation. He needed to craft a narrative about a distant cousin or a strange coincidence. But his brain, usually so adept at fabricating reality, failed him completely. The shock of seeing the living proof of his moral bankruptcy paralyzed his cognitive functions. My father attempted to salvage the wreck. He stepped between Spencer and Claire, projecting the false authority of a corporate leader managing a crisis. "Claire, it is nothing," Richard said, his voice tight and unconvincing. "It is a misunderstanding. Norah is simply trying to cause a scene. We need to leave now." He grabbed Spencer's elbow, attempting to pull him away from the alcove. He needed to extract his heir before the journalist at the center table noticed the implosion. But Claire did not move. She planted her feet firmly on the carpet. She refused to be ushered away like a naive subordinate. She looked at me. She recognized that I was the only person in the immediate vicinity who was not currently drowning in panic. Norah, Claire said, maintaining her composure through a hard, dangerous edge entered her tone. I asked a question. "Whose child is this?" The entire Dixon family held their breath. They waited for me to drop the final hammer. They waited for me to scream the truth across the restaurant, to detonate the scandal and destroy their empire in a blaze of public vengeance. But I did not scream. I did not raise my voice. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the white tablecloth. I looked directly into my brother's terrified eyes. I think Spencer should answer that I said my voice calm and perfectly steady. After all, he is the one campaigning on a platform of protecting Montana's vulnerable youth. He should be thrilled to introduce his son to the press. The trap had fully closed. The heavy steel jaws snapped shut, trapping the golden heir, the ruthless patriarch, and the complicit mother in a public cage of their own design. They were surrounded by affluent witnesses, a political journalist, and a fiancé demanding the truth. The illusion of their pristine legacy was officially dead. The only remaining question was how violently they would thrash against the bars before the final blow landed. The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. I think Spencer should answer that. Silence, thicker and more oppressive than before, suffocated our corner of the dining room. The faint clatter of silverware and the low hum of jazz music seemed entirely disconnected from the reality fracturing within our alcove. Claire stared at my brother. She did not blink. She waited for the denial, the excuse, or the political spin she had witnessed him deploy 100 times during debates. Spencer opened his mouth, a desperate, frantic sound escaping his throat. "It is," he began, his voice cracking. "It is a mistake. Claire, it is a setup. She is trying to ruin the campaign. She found some kid who looks like me to extort us." It was a pathetic, crumbling defense. Even as he spoke the words, the lie sounded hollow. The physical evidence sitting in the high chair was too profound to dismiss as a simple coincidence of genetics. Claire possessed a sharp intellect. She did not require a degree in biology to understand the mathematical impossibility of two unrelated humans sharing the exact same icy blue irises, the identical slope of the jaw, and the distinct crescent birthmark she had surely noticed on Spencer's neck during their relationship. Claire did not argue. She did not raise her voice or demand further explanation. She simply took a slow, deliberate step backward, distancing herself from the man she had planned to marry. The movement spoke volumes. It was the physical manifestation of her trust evaporating. My father, observing the rapid dissolution of Spencer's engagement and the impending collapse of his political future, shifted tactics. The shock of the reveal morphed, distilling rapidly into the emotion Richard Dixon utilized best: aggressive, unyielding entitlement. Richard did not view the child sitting before him as a human being who had spent 14 months fighting for breath in a borrowed crib. He did not view Leo as a grandson who needed love or protection. He viewed him as a reclaimed asset. The boy possessed the Dixon name, the Dixon genetics, and the required male biology to inherit the empire. The fact that I had nurtured and saved the child was irrelevant. The asset belonged to the patriarch. Richard leaned heavily over the white tablecloth, pressing his knuckles into the linen. He brought his face close to mine, ensuring his voice remained a venomous, localized whisper. He needed to contain the blast radius, preventing the journalist across the room from catching a single syllable of the exchange. "You think this is a game?" Norah Richard hissed his breath, carrying the sharp scent of expensive mints and dark coffee. "You think you can engineer this little stunt and walk away? You are delusional." I met his gaze, my expression completely neutral. "I am not playing a game, Dad. I am having lunch." He ignored the response. His eyes darted to Leo, assessing the boy with the cold calculation of an actuary reviewing a balance sheet. "He is a Dixon," Richard stated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "He belongs at the ranch. He belongs with the family, not sequestered in your little condo. We will take over custody immediately." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the demand nearly made me laugh. After orchestrating budget cuts to starve me out, after ignoring my pleas for medical support, and after formally forfeiting his interest in the child just 12 hours prior, he believed he could simply issue a command and rewrite reality. He assumed his immense wealth functioned as a universal skeleton key, capable of unlocking any door and reversing any consequence. "We will hire a proper nanny," Diane added, her voice trembling but gaining a fraction of its former aristocratic steel. "We will get him the best specialists. We can manage his care. You cannot possibly provide the environment he requires, Norah. It is simply not appropriate." They were already restructuring their world to accommodate the new heir. They envisioned a scenario where they swept the child back to the estate, buried the scandalous details of his maternity, and presented him to society as a tragic noble rescue mission led by their golden son. They expected me to fold. They expected the family fixer to hand over the goods and retreat quietly into the shadows. Before I could formulate a response, Vanessa finally inserted herself into the conversation. My older sister had remained entirely oblivious to the genetic bomb that had just leveled the alcove. She lacked the situational awareness to read the terror on her mother's face or the panic in her brother's eyes. Vanessa existed in a superficial bubble, concerned solely with optics and social inconvenience. "Can we please stop causing a scene?" Vanessa whined, tapping her manicured nails against the screen of her smartphone. "You are ruining Spencer's press day, Norah. The reporter is literally sitting right over there. Why did you even bring the stray baby here? It is completely inappropriate. Just hand him over to Mom and Dad so we can get back to normal." The stark contrast between Vanessa's trivial complaining and the life-ruining gravity of the moment surrounding the three men at the table was staggering. She called the boy a stray while standing next to his biological father, who was currently watching his entire political and social future disintegrate. I looked at my sister, then shifted my gaze back to my father. I maintained a posture of absolute, unreadable calm. I let their demands settle over the table, allowing the weight of their entitlement to fully articulate itself in the silence. "You are demanding custody," I said, repeating the premise to ensure absolute clarity. "You want to take him back to the estate." "Yes," Richard snapped, his patience evaporating. "Do not make this difficult, Norah. You know you cannot win a legal battle against me. I will bury you in litigation. I will tie this up in family court until you are bankrupt. Hand him over now, and we will compensate you for your interim expenses." He offered to reimburse me. He attempted to treat the last 14 months of terror, sleepless nights, and unconditional love as a temporary fostering contract he could settle with a check. I reached down and picked up my crystal water glass. I took another slow sip, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat. I set the glass down, ensuring the base aligned perfectly with the moisture ring on the tablecloth. "I cannot do that, Richard," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "And why is that?" he demanded, leaning closer, his eyes narrowing into dark, threatening slits. "Because you are 3 hours too late," I said. I reached into the heavy leather diaper bag resting on the floor beside my chair. The time for quiet endurance had expired. The trap had closed, the demands were issued, and it was time to deploy the objective truth. I did not pull out baby wipes or a spare pacifier. I closed my hand around the thick, sealed manila envelope containing the genetic results, the property records, and the legally binding forfeiture. It was time to dismantle the empire. My hand rested inside the leather bag, my fingers gripping the smooth paper of the thick manila envelope. Across the low mahogany partition, Spencer was unraveling. The polished engineered facade of the rising political star dissolved into the frantic, erratic movements of a cornered animal. He reached out, wrapping his fingers around Claire's elbow. He attempted to pull her away from our table, his grip tight and desperate. "Claire, we are leaving right now," Spencer instructed. His voice carried a thin, reedy pitch, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. "This is a sick coincidence. My sister has always harbored a deep resentment toward this family. She found a child in the foster system who shares a passing resemblance to me, and she is using him to stage a public spectacle. It is a setup. Do not listen to a word she says." He tried to guide her backward toward the center of the dining room, aiming to put distance between his fiancée and the undeniable genetic copy sitting in the high chair. But Claire did not yield. She possessed a strong, grounded center of gravity. She pulled her arm free from his grasp, stepping closer to the edge of our alcove. Her eyes darted from Spencer's sweating forehead to the calm, steady rhythm of my breathing. She recognized the stark difference between a man fabricating a defense and a woman holding the truth. I pulled the heavy envelope from my bag. The brass clasp on the back glinted under the warm light of the Italian chandeliers. I placed it flat against the white linen tablecloth. "It is no coincidence, Spencer," I said. I pushed the envelope forward. The thick paper made a soft, continuous scratching sound as it glided over the fabric, coming to a halt directly in the center of the table. As I mentioned earlier, I continued keeping my tone conversational and precise. Leo required a comprehensive genetic baseline. His pulmonologist grew concerned about the severity of his respiratory distress. His asthma attacks were specific, severe, and resistant to standard treatments, just like yours were, Spencer. The medical team needed to map his biological history to keep him alive. So I ran the markers. My father recognized the shape of a loaded weapon. Richard Dixon spent his life negotiating hostile corporate takeovers. He understood the danger of documented evidence resting in plain sight. He lunged forward, his heavy arm reaching across the table to snatch the envelope before its contents could see the light of day. He intended to confiscate it, bury it in his suit pocket, and march his family out the front doors. But Richard underestimated the woman standing next to him. Claire was faster. She belonged to a legacy of prominent Helena diplomats who taught their daughters to read a room and seize the narrative. She intercepted the envelope a fraction of a second before my father's fingers could graze the paper. She pulled it toward her chest, stepping out of his immediate reach. Richard froze his arm extended over the table. He could not forcefully pry the document from her hands. Wrestling with a prominent socialite in the middle of the Silver Line Bistro would guarantee a front-page scandal by morning. He was trapped by the very social decorum he used to manipulate others. He lowered his arm, his jaw clenching so tight the muscles twitched beneath his skin. Claire unspooled the small string wrapping the brass tie. She opened the flap. She reached inside and pulled out the crisp, white stack of documents. The dining room around us seemed to hold its breath. Even Vanessa lowered her smartphone, sensing the lethal shift in the atmosphere. Claire looked at the first page. It was the heavy, watermarked report from the private California laboratory. The header displayed the official medical insignia. Her eyes scanned the dense paragraphs of methodology and allele charts, seeking the final conclusion at the bottom. I watched her read the bolded text. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. A shadow passed over her features. The polite, curious expression of a supportive partner vanished. The betrayal registered instantly, hardening the soft lines around her mouth and turning her gaze into something cold and sharp. She realized she had spent the last year sharing a bed with a man who abandoned his own flesh to suffocate in the municipal foster system. She realized the grand speeches about protecting vulnerable youth were built on a foundation of profound moral rot. She did not stop reading. She flipped to the second page. It was the property tax record for the Whispering Pines Motel. I had highlighted the ownership details, drawing a clear line from the derelict property where the biological mother suffered her fatal overdose, straight to Blue Ridge Holdings, the shell corporation managed by Richard Dixon's senior legal counsel. Claire's breathing slowed. The scope of the deception expanded in her mind. This was not merely the hidden mistake of a reckless son. It was a coordinated structural cover-up facilitated by the patriarch. The entire family was complicit in burying a young woman and discarding her infant. She turned to the third page. It was the printed email exchange from the previous night. She read my polite inquiry regarding their interest in the child. Then she read Richard's blistering, legally binding rejection. "We have no ties to that child. We forfeit any association with your charity case." She held the documentation of their arrogance in her hands. They had thrown the child away twice, once in a cheap motel and again in a corporate email. Claire lowered the papers. She did not scream. She did not throw her drink in Spencer's face or unleash a torrent of profanity. She possessed too much dignity to grant them the satisfaction of an emotional breakdown. She understood that quiet, deliberate action inflicted far more damage than noise. She looked at Spencer. The golden heir stood near the partition, his shoulders slumped, his tailored suit suddenly looking hollow and ill-fitting. He awaited her judgment, offering a weak, pleading look that begged for mercy. Claire offered none. She reached for her left hand. Her fingers gripped the multi-carat diamond engagement ring resting on her ring finger. The stone was flawless, hand-selected by Spencer to project an image of undeniable wealth and traditional commitment. She pulled it over her knuckle in one smooth, fluid motion. She held the ring suspended above Spencer's crystal water glass. "I am returning your investment," Claire stated. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet the quiet precision of her words cut through the alcove like a surgical blade. She opened her fingers. The heavy platinum band and the flawless diamond dropped into the water. It made a sharp, distinct splash, sinking past the floating ice cubes to settle at the bottom of the crystal glass. The small ripples faded, leaving the surface smooth and undisturbed. Claire did not wait for a response. She placed the stack of documents back onto the center of the white tablecloth, ensuring the DNA results remained face up for my father to read. She turned her back on the Dixon family, adjusted her sleek clutch purse under her arm, and walked away. She navigated the maze of dining tables with perfect posture. She walked past the center table, ignoring the confused expression of the capital city journalist. She pushed through the heavy glass doors of the bistro and stepped out into the damp Montana afternoon, exiting Spencer's life forever. I remained in my seat, watching my brother stare at the submerged diamond. Spencer was left standing in the middle of the restaurant, stripped of his wealthy backer, his pristine public image, and his political future. He was socially naked, exposed as a fraud before the very press he courted. The campaign he built on family values had just imploded into a puddle of ice water. The illusion was dead. The reality of his choices now stood at his table, waiting to deliver the final legal blow. The front doors of the bistro swung shut behind Claire, sealing the silence within our alcove. The heavy platinum ring resting at the bottom of Spencer's water glass served as the definitive punctuation mark on the collapse of his political future. The capital city journalist, sitting across the dining room, was no longer observing a campaign lunch. He was bearing witness to the sudden, unexplained dissolution of a prominent conservative engagement. Spencer stood paralyzed, staring at the submerged diamond trapped in the immediate shock of his own ruin. But my father did not possess the luxury of shock. Richard Dixon was a man defined by his instinct to conquer and control. When an asset slipped from his grasp, his immediate reflex was to deploy his immense wealth to bludgeon the opposition into submission. The loss of Claire's family backing was a significant political blow, but the revelation sitting in the high chair represented a fundamental threat to his legacy. The pure Dixon bloodline, the biological male heir he coveted above all else, was currently under my guardianship. The color rushed back into Richard's face, a dark, furious crimson, replacing the pale ash of his initial panic. He grabbed the stack of documents Claire had left on the tablecloth. He did not bother to read the property records or the printed email. He stared only at the DNA results. The 99.9% probability was a mathematical certainty he could not negotiate or intimidate out of existence. He slammed the paper down against the linen. The crystal glasses rattled. "You think this piece of paper grants you ownership?" Richard growled, his voice a low, vibrating engine of pure malice. He abandoned the venomous whisper, his anger bleeding into a volume that caused nearby diners to shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You think you can steal my grandson, humiliate my son in public, and walk away clean? You have no idea what you have just initiated, Norah." I kept my hands resting lightly in my lap. I did not lean away from his hostility. "I am not stealing anything, Dad. I am having lunch with my son." He scoffed a harsh, abrasive sound. "Your son. He is a Dixon. He possesses my blood. I will hire a fleet of the most aggressive family law litigators in the state of Montana by the end of the business day. I will file an emergency injunction to seize custody. I will sue you for fraud, for deliberate concealment of paternity, and for emotional distress. I will tie you up in court for the next 10 years. I will bleed your meager bank account dry. And when you are destitute, I will take the boy back to the estate where he belongs." My mother Diane wiped her damp cheeks with her napkin, nodding in frantic agreement. "We will tell the judge you are unstable," she added, her voice trembling but eager to contribute to the assault. "We will say you manipulated a vulnerable situation. No court will grant a single low-level clinic administrator custody of a child when a wealthy, prominent family is willing to provide a superior environment." They were returning to their standard operating procedure. They intended to crush me under the sheer weight of their resources. They assumed the legal system operated on a sliding scale, where enough capital could rewrite reality and erase my 14 months of dedicated care. They expected the threat of endless litigation to trigger my capitulation. I reached back into my leather tote bag. The manila envelope had delivered the shock, but it was not the final weapon in my arsenal. I withdrew a single folded sheet of standard legal paper. It lacked the heavy watermark of the laboratory report, but it possessed a far more devastating power. I unfolded the document and placed it precisely over the DNA results. "I am afraid you will find the family court system remarkably uncooperative. Richard." I stated my tone, devoid of anger, presenting the information with the cool detachment of a bank teller explaining a declined transaction. Richard looked down at the new piece of paper. He saw the official letterhead of the Missoula County Courthouse. He saw the date stamped clearly in black ink near the top margin. Today's date. He saw the specific legal terminology detailing the permanent transfer of guardianship. And at the bottom of the page, he saw the bold, unmistakable signature of Judge Miller, sealed with the embossed stamp of the state. It was the final adoption decree, signed, filed, and legally binding as of 9 o'clock that morning. "You are threatening to sue for custody of a child who is already legally mine," I explained, watching the furious crimson drain from his face once again. "The time for injunctions and emergency motions expired 3 hours ago while you were busy boycotting the ceremony." My father stared at the signature. The legal reality began to crush the momentum of his rage. He understood the profound difficulty of overturning a finalized adoption decree. It required proving gross negligence or systemic fraud, a nearly impossible hurdle when the adoptive parent possessed a spotless record and the biological family had shown zero prior interest. But Richard Dixon was desperate. He grasped at the only remaining thread. "This is fraudulent," he spat, pointing a thick finger at the decree. "Spencer was never notified. You cannot finalize an adoption without terminating the rights of the biological father. The court will tear this piece of paper to shreds the moment we prove he was unaware of the child's existence." I shifted my gaze toward my brother. Spencer was still leaning against the mahogany partition, his eyes fixed on the empty space where Claire had stood. He looked broken, a hollow shell of the confident politician who had entered the restaurant. "You are correct, Dad," I said. "A biological father must have his rights terminated, but the court does not require active consent when the father legally abandons the child." I turned fully toward Spencer. The state intake file clearly notes that the biological mother refused to name a father on the birth certificate. Following her death, the state placed Leo in foster care. According to Montana law, if a biological parent fails to step forward and establish a relationship or provide financial support within 6 months of the child entering the system, they are deemed to have abandoned their parental rights. I paused, letting the timeline sink in. "Leo has been in the system for 14 months, Spencer. You knew the girl. You handed her a thick envelope of cash 4 days before she died in a motel your family owns. You knew she was pregnant, and you chose to walk away. The court considers your absence a legal surrender." Spencer closed his eyes, his head dropping forward. He possessed a law degree. He understood the absolute validity of the statute. His attempt to buy silence had ultimately stripped him of his claim. "And as for your rights, Richard," I continued, returning my attention to the patriarch. "The court requires adoptive parents to conduct a diligent search for any extended family members who might claim an interest in the child before finalizing the decree. I fulfilled that requirement last night." I tapped my fingernail against the printed email resting beneath the decree. "I sent you a formal inquiry asking if the Dixon family claimed any ties, rights, or interest in this child. You responded from your verified corporate account. You explicitly wrote that you forfeit any association with my charity case. You signed away your standing to contest this adoption before you even knew his name." The legal checkmate was absolute. I had built a fortress around my son, using their own arrogance as the mortar. They had abandoned the child, boycotted the ceremony, and legally documented their forfeiture. They possessed no legal standing, no biological claim, and no pathway to reverse the decree. But my father was a cornered predator. He possessed a vast fortune, and he might still attempt to drag me into a frivolous, exhausting lawsuit just to punish me for the humiliation. I needed to paralyze his ability to weaponize his wealth. I needed to guarantee they would never file a single motion. I leaned forward, closing the distance, my voice dropping to a low, cold frequency that matched his earlier venom. "You can hire your fleet of litigators, Richard. You can file your motions and drag us into court. But I want you to consider the cost of discovery." I pointed to the stack of documents on the table. "If you initiate a legal battle, every single piece of paper sitting on this table becomes public record. It enters the court docket. The DNA results proving Spencer fathered a child out of wedlock will become public. The property records proving the mother died of an overdose in a derelict motel owned by Blue Ridge Holdings will become public. The security footage of Spencer paying her off will be entered into evidence." I looked at my brother, then back to my father. "Spencer's campaign on foster care reform will not just end. It will become a national scandal. The press will dissect your shell corporations. The state will launch an investigation into the conditions of the motel. The pristine Dixon legacy you have spent your entire life protecting will become front-page tabloid trash. You will be known as the family who paid a pregnant girl to disappear and left the heir to suffocate in the municipal system." The silence in the alcove was absolute. The threat of public exposure was the only weapon capable of neutralizing Richard Dixon. He stared at the documents, his mind racing through the catastrophic public relations fallout. He realized I held the detonator, and he knew I possessed the resolve to press the button. So I concluded, sitting back in my chair, "You do not have a grandson, Richard. You have a nephew, and legally permanently, he is my son. You will not file a single motion. You will not contact my clinic. You will return to your estate, and you will leave us alone." They were financially robust, socially prominent, and entirely, utterly defeated by the daughter they thought was too weak to fight back. The silence holding our alcove captive possessed a different texture now. It was no longer the tense, suffocating quiet of a pending ambush. It was the heavy, stagnant stillness of a defeated empire. My father stared at the stack of documents resting on the white linen tablecloth. He did not reach for them again. His hands remained flat against his thighs. The ferocious energy that usually propelled his corporate conquests had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, aging man who had just realized his vast wealth held zero currency in this room. He knew I would pull the trigger. He recognized the cold, unyielding resolve in my voice. If he filed a single piece of litigation, I would hand the genetic results and the property records directly to the journalist sitting 40 feet away. I would burn his legacy to the ground, and he understood I would not lose a minute of sleep watching the ashes scatter. I broke eye contact. I turned my attention away from the three people who had spent my entire life measuring my worth against a ledger. I reached toward the wooden high chair. I unbuckled the safety harness, the plastic clips snapping open with a sharp, functional sound. I lifted Leo into my arms. He rested his head against my shoulder, his small fingers twisting a strand of my hair. He remained entirely oblivious to the monumental shift in power that had just occurred above his head. Sarah and Mark stood up simultaneously. My coworkers did not say a word, but their movements were swift and deliberate. Mark grabbed the heavy leather diaper bag, hoisting the strap over his shoulder. Sarah collected her purse and my wool coat. They formed a quiet, loyal barrier, shielding me from any desperate last-minute tactics my family might attempt to deploy. I adjusted Leo on my hip, ensuring his bright blue knit sweater remained smooth against his chest. I opened my wallet. I retrieved 2 crisp $100 bills. I dropped the currency directly onto the center of the table, placing the cash right next to the signed adoption decree. "I am covering our tab," I stated, my voice echoing clearly over the ambient noise of the bistro. I refused to owe this family a single cent. My sister Vanessa kept her eyes glued to her phone screen, pretending the catastrophic dismantling of her family structure was not happening. My father refused to look up from the table, but my mother looked at me. Diane Dixon stared at the daughter she had deemed a disappointment, holding the grandson she had deemed a stray. Her aristocratic armor had dissolved. Her face looked drawn, fragile, and marked by a profound, irreversible regret. She realized the staggering cost of her prejudice. She had traded her only heir for the hollow comfort of her own snobbery. I met her gaze. I did not offer a smile of triumph. I offered the cool, factual delivery of a completed contract. "You told me no stranger inherits Dixon land," I said, allowing the words to hang in the air between us. "You were right, Mom. He will not inherit your land. He will inherit my peace instead." I turned my back on the alcove. I walked away from the table, carrying my son through the maze of white linens and crystal centerpieces. Mark and Sarah flanked me, our small, chosen family moving in unison. We passed the center table where Spencer remained frozen, staring at his water glass. We passed the capital city journalist, who was now furiously scribbling notes, sensing the invisible shockwave radiating from our corner of the room. We walked past the mahogany hostess podium, pushed through the heavy brass doors, and stepped out into the crisp, unfiltered Montana air. The aftermath of that afternoon unfolded with swift, clinical precision. The consequences of my family's arrogance arrived not as a sudden explosion, but as a slow, agonizing rot. Spencer watched his political ambitions wither within weeks. Claire's departure sent an immediate silent signal through the affluent networks of the state capital. Her father, a prominent power broker, made a handful of discreet phone calls. The campaign donations dried up overnight. The glowing profile the journalist intended to write was quietly scrapped, replaced by a vague, damaging piece about Spencer's lack of transparent leadership. The rumors began to circulate, whispering through the country clubs and the charity galas. By the time November arrived, Spencer lost the election by a humiliating margin. He retreated from the public eye, his pristine image shattered, his law firm quietly shifting him to a windowless office reserved for liabilities. My parents fared no better. Richard and Diane returned to their sprawling gated estate. They retained their immense wealth, their commercial properties, and their luxury vehicles. But the mansion transformed into a sterile mausoleum. They had spent decades obsessing over their lineage, praying for a male heir to carry the Dixon crest into the next generation. Now they lived with the agonizing knowledge that the heir existed. He possessed their eyes. He possessed their jawline. He lived a mere 10-minute drive from their front gates. Yet, due to their own explicit documented forfeiture, they were legally barred from ever speaking his name. They built a fortress to keep the world out, only to realize they had locked themselves inside a prison of their own design. As for Leo and me, the departure from that restaurant marked the beginning of an era defined by profound quiet. With the genetic baseline secured from the laboratory, Leo's medical team charted a new, highly effective treatment protocol. They adjusted his medications, predicting the specific triggers of his autoimmune responses. The terrifying late-night emergency room visits ceased. The heavy nebulizer machine found a permanent home on the top shelf of the hallway closet gathering dust instead of running on endless midnight loops. My condo, once a triage center, fueled by sheer endurance, became a home filled with genuine warmth. Sarah and Mark visited on weekends, bringing takeout food and playing with Leo on the living room rug. We celebrated milestones without the suffocating weight of judgment or the exhausting requirement to perform for an audience. 6 months after the adoption became final, I sat on my back porch. The late spring sun dipped toward the horizon, casting a long golden glow over the tops of the pine trees. The Montana air smelled of damp earth and blooming sage. Leo sat on a quilt near my feet, stacking wooden blocks. He wore a simple cotton shirt, his blonde hair catching the evening light. He knocked a small tower over, clapping his hands together and letting out a bright, unrestrained laugh. He looked up at me. His irises shone with that striking, icy blue hue. Those eyes were no longer a haunting reminder of a dark secret. They were no longer a weapon I needed to wield against a corrupt dynasty. They were just eyes. They belonged to a little boy who knew nothing of Shell Corporation's political scandals or mahogany dining tables. He knew only the safety of my voice and the security of our modest, peaceful life. Blood does not make a family. Genetics provide a blueprint, but they do not guarantee loyalty, protection, or unconditional care. The people who share your DNA can build the trap, but the people who show up when the room is dark are the ones who help you break the lock. And sometimes the best way to protect your peace is to simply step aside and let the people who underestimated you choke on the bitter reality of their own truth. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic table and build your own family from scratch, this story is for you. Drop a comment sharing your own quiet victory. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next one. We spend the majority of our lives building monuments we cannot take with us. In the sprawling landscape of American culture, success is so frequently measured by the tangible weight of what we leave behind. A booming business, a sturdy house, a recognizable surname etched into the slate of a corporate building. We are taught to chase the American dream of establishing a legacy, often envisioning it as an impenetrable fortress we can pass down to our children. But as the dust settles on the wreckage of the Dixon family empire, a quieter, far more profound question emerges from the ruins. What is the actual currency of a lasting legacy? When we examine the traditional family structure, we often look for the recognizable hallmarks of stability. Richard and Diane Dixon possessed every external marker of the perfect American household. They had the sprawling estate, the Sunday dinners around a mahogany table, the carefully curated holiday photographs, and the financial resources to provide their children with unparalleled advantages. Yet beneath that pristine veneer, their parenting values were bankrupt. They treated their family tree like a corporate ledger, where children were not individuals to be nurtured, but assets to be managed and branded. This is the great peril of raising children without emotional awareness. When parents prioritize optics over authenticity, they fail to provide the long-term guidance a child actually needs to navigate the moral complexities of the world. Richard and Diane groomed Spencer to be a golden heir, but in doing so, they stripped him of his humanity. They taught him that his worth was tethered strictly to his public achievements and his ability to project a flawless image. More dangerously, they taught him that accountability was something you could simply purchase your way out of. When Spencer handed an envelope of cash to a desperate pregnant girl, he was merely executing the exact conflict resolution strategy his father had modeled for him 10 years prior. True family responsibility cannot be bought, and it certainly cannot be inherited through a bank transfer. It is forged in the quiet, unglamorous moments that no one else sees. It is found sitting under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of an emergency room at 3 a.m, holding an oxygen mask over a struggling infant's face. It is the conscious, daily choice to place another human being's well-being above your own comfort. Norah Dixon understood this fundamental truth. She recognized that bringing a child into your life, whether through biology or through the profound choice of adoption, is a sacred vow to be their shield, not their stage manager. In a society that frequently rewards the loud, the wealthy, and the performative, we often forget that honesty and fairness are the only load-bearing pillars capable of sustaining a family through generational storms. Spencer built a political campaign on the platform of family values, yet his foundation was constructed entirely on a buried lie. He abandoned his own son to protect a career trajectory. But lies, no matter how deeply they are buried in transient motels or hushed payoffs, possess a corrosive nature. They rot the structure from the inside out. When Claire dropped her multi-carat engagement ring into a glass of ice water, she was not just rejecting a man, she was rejecting a legacy devoid of fairness. She recognized that a family operating without truth is merely a cartel bound by shared secrets. Raising children with emotional awareness means giving them the tools to face their own reflections without flinching. It requires the courage to say, "We make mistakes, but we own them." If Spencer had been raised in a home where honesty was valued over reputation, the tragedy of the motel might never have occurred. He might have possessed the moral fortitude to stand by the mother of his child. Instead, he was raised to fear the loss of his status more than the loss of his soul. Norah broke that toxic lineage the moment she walked away from the mahogany dining table. By choosing a sick, abandoned boy over $1 billion inheritance, she redefined what it means to protect a bloodline. She protected Leo not by hiding him behind wrought iron gates, but by removing him entirely from the poisoned soil of his ancestors. The long-term guidance she will offer him will not consist of lessons on how to crush a rival or silence a liability. It will be rooted in the quiet strength of knowing you are loved precisely as you are, asthma and all, without conditions or corporate expectations. The story of the Dixon family serves as a mirror held up to our own lives. We must ask ourselves what we are truly passing down to the next generation. Are we handing them a heavy silver money clip, engraved with expectations they can never fulfill? Or are we giving them the emotional vocabulary to navigate a difficult world with integrity? If you find yourself reflecting on the quiet battles you have fought to protect your own peace, and if you believe that earned justice is the most satisfying resolution of all, I invite you to join our community. Drop a comment below with your own thoughts on what truly makes a family, and hit that subscribe button to follow Aura Vengeance. We specialize in stories where the truth refuses to stay buried, and where the quiet ones finally get the last word. We all have a seat at a table somewhere. We all inherit something from the people who came before us, and we all decide what to serve to the people who come next. When the plates are finally cleared, the lights dim, and the grand performances of our lives draw to a close, what will remain in the empty chairs? Will it be the heavy, suffocating silence of secrets we were too afraid to confess? Or will it be the simple, enduring peace of a life lived in the light, where nothing needs to be hidden and no one is ever left to weather the storm alone?